Welcome everyone. Thanks for being with us today to help us answering the big question, what's next for politics and lawmaking, but mostly what's new, what's normal, what's the exceptional. That's what we will try to find out today with our dear guests. Democrat State Senator Michael Rodrigues, or Rodrigues in Portuguese, from Massachusetts, was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate in 2010. Prior to being elected to the Senate, Senator Rodrigues served 14 years in the House of Representatives. And he is also graduated from the University of Massachusetts with a Bachelor of Science in Accounting. Senator Rodrigues was also distinguished by the President of Portugal in 2010 with the Medal of the Prince Harry the Navigator. Then we have David T. Vieira, State Representative from the Republican Party, also in Massachusetts. Also Eagle Scout David T. Vieira was born and raised in T-Ticket. On January 5th, 2011, David was sworn in as a member of Massachusetts House of Representatives, received his BA in Communications, Legal, Institution, Economics, and Government from the American University in 1997, and a Master of Public Administration from Suffolk University in 2004. I hope the whole CV is correct. Then we have the socialist member of the Portuguese Parliament, Isabel Moreira, master's degree in constitutional law and in fundamental rights, also a lawyer. And in a few moments, I hope to have also another member of the Portuguese Parliament, the Deputy Ricardo Baptista Leite. He's a national spokesperson for health of the Social Democratic Party, medical doctor trained in infection diseases, and a head of public health at Católica University of Portugal. Welcome everyone. I hope we have a great discussion about the most difficult question, that is to try to guess what's next in this stage we are now of the pandemic crisis. I guess one of the things is true for everyone. This pandemic is absolutely new and different of anything else we ever experienced. My first question is, all countries has their own emergency legislation, but really does any of this legislation is sufficient to respond to the sanitary crisis and at the same time to the economic and social crisis we are all live right now? Maybe I will start with the Portuguese Deputy Isabel Moreira. Do you think that all the legislation we have here in Portugal is sufficient?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet you all. I think it's of course it's something completely without any precedent, and I think there is the need of a strong political consensus, and that's the first step to have enough legislation to face this situation, and a strong political consensus under such a crisis. Because we had to make first emergency legislation, and that legislation was passed in our parliament, and it happened due to conscience of most political parties. So I think it was possible, and it has been possible because all parties, or most parties, understood that no one in our country, people and companies, wouldn't accept that in such circumstances we wouldn't respond as members of parliament with immediate legislation, not only to respond in terms of our rights and freedoms in what comes to in that moment where we couldn't leave home unless to do the basic things, but also to the laws that have to do with economy, with the labor laws and things that we have to put in place, and that were scratched from zero, because no one was prepared to face this unprecedented crisis. So there was nothing to face this. So we really had to make laws from scratch. Of course, many of those laws was made in the parliament, but in what comes to everyday law, the law is made by the government, and the fact that we are at the parliament has another meaning, which is to make the government accountable. And obviously, I think all the parliamentary groups in Portugal have played in what comes to this issue a very important role. Of course, knowing that this is a very, very special moment, but also making the government accountable and with their own proposals and making their own views being heard. And we have, of course, everyone, the public eye on us, and I think no one would understand that in such a situation we wouldn't be responding with all the legislation that has to be made. It would be impossible to understand. So I think the answer is yes. We are. I think making the legislation is not the main issue. The main issue will be to overcome the enormous economic and social crisis that we will live, and we are already living due to this tremendous and unprecedented crisis, as I was telling. I think your microphone is off.
Sorry. Yeah. Let me first welcome the Ricardo Baptista Leite. Thank you for joining us. I was trying to ask to the state representative David. I was listening to Isabel Moreira, and I was questioning myself that the crisis that we are facing is like every day we discover something new. We have to respond to something new, or sometimes we have to make a new law. Other times we have to make a new decision. The government, the parliament, ourselves, the citizens. How challenge is this for a politician right now?
So as we started with this crisis in Massachusetts, our legislature was meeting in what's called informal sessions, and Senator Rodrigues was covering the Senate, and I was covering for the minority party in the House, where we have a representative of each political party in the chamber, but it requires unanimous consent to pass any legislation in those informal sessions. So for the first number of weeks or a couple months, that we didn't have a mechanism to take a recorded roll call vote. And so we had to make sure that we had 100% agreement on these pieces of legislation as they moved through. And one of my favorite stories is, as a Republican, I'm a member of the Conservative Party, but the first time someone objected and wanted to shut a session down was a liberal member of the Democratic Party. And then a week later, a conservative member of the Republican Party came in and wanted to shut the session down. And so during that period of time, we needed to meet with them, hear their concerns, and work on compromise so that we could pass legislation with a majority vote. Since then, we now have the ability in both chambers to do formal roll call votes. And even with that, I know this morning Parliament passed a supplemental budget, and there was a split from some of the parties. I think the Communist Party voted against it, PSD. But our supplemental budget in Massachusetts, even with a roll call vote, received unanimous roll calls of the Republicans and the Democrats working together. And part of that is the time leading up to the vote and hearing the concerns of the minority members, the parties, and incorporating those concerns so that we could show a united front to show our constituents and to show the members, the people of the Commonwealth, that we're working together, even though we disagree on many political points, that we are working together to address the crisis on their behalf. And so it's challenging, particularly when you need unanimous consent, but now we have the roll call vote, so we don't need unanimous consent, but we still try to bring that coalition together and to seek bipartisan support.
So, Michael, do you think this political consensus that we just heard, mostly in Massachusetts right now, but do you think it's possible to keep going with this political consensus in the US regarding mostly having in account that there are elections in this year?
I think in Massachusetts, you will continue to see legislative leaders on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, continue to work together collaboratively. We have an overwhelming Democratic majority in Massachusetts in the legislature, but we have a Republican governor in Charlie Baker. We all work very well together. We, as the term goes, we agree to disagree. And we believe very strongly that with good open disagreement and good debate, we produce a better finished product. The challenge, of course, is that that type of attitude does not resonate in Washington, D.C., that we see very hard partisan disagreements down in D.C., and it hurts us in Massachusetts because during this unprecedented crisis, and everyone is correct that there is no playbook for this. We can't go back to look into history to say, how did we deal with this last pandemic? Because the last one, at least in the United States, was back in 1918, and it was completely different. We've had fiscal and financial recessions before. We had one a dozen years ago. That was the result of the financial industry collapse. We had one back in 2001 and 2002, the post 9/11 so-called tech bubble collapse. But both of those recessions were caused by financial fiscal problems or issues. This time, it's a virus that's causing this financial recession. And that prior to this virus, as you know, in the middle of February, the end of February, the U.S. economy was doing really well. Massachusetts was doing really well. We were scheduled again to be on the path of between 3% and 4% revenue growth in the Commonwealth. And then all of a sudden the virus hits. We put our economy in a self-induced coma, in a suspended animation, if you will. And since then, we in the Senate and Representative Vieira in the House have been working nonstop on both fiscal, budgetary matters and policy matters as it relates solely to the pandemic. And it's been a whirlwind, but we've been working very well together.
Ricardo, Baptista, Leite, welcome again. We are here talking about the political consensus and how important that is to face this pandemic. But my question is, do you think it's possible to keep going with this political consensus now that we are entering in a new phase, more into the economical and social problems that this pandemic bring to all the countries? Do you think it's possible to keep going with this political consensus? Today in Portugal, the government passed in the parliament the supplementary budget with the abstention of your party. But do you believe that with the time and with the crisis, and it's possible to keep going with this consensus?
Hello, Anselmo, and my apologies for coming in late, but I was actually watching the interesting debate. But for one reason or another, I wasn't able to come online. And thank you to the foundation for the kind invitation. And I'd like to greet Isabel, of course, and our dear colleagues across the pond in Massachusetts, where I was, it seems like very long ago, but it was just a couple of years ago. I think that it is very important to show that in times of crisis, responsible leadership, even in the opposition, means finding and being capable of building bridges and finding spaces for unity. And I think that especially in the space of the pandemic, in the face of the pandemic, we were clearly facing a common enemy. And in that sense, we must acknowledge that the pandemic is still ongoing. And this has not ended. And we will probably have months to come dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic on the social and economic front, but also dealing with the public health challenges that are far from over, as we can see here in the Lisbon region. And so, yes, we do need to continue finding common ground. The agree to disagree may happen once in a while. We clearly share different views on some of the policies. We never stopped sharing those views to the government, but we try to do it in a constructive way. I believe that criticism in politics is part of its nature, but it only makes sense if it comes with alternative solutions, even if whoever is governing, in this case coming from the opposition, does not agree with our solutions. And hopefully we can find that middle ground moving forward. But the economic and social storm that is building is so tremendous that I think this is one of those moments that we have to recall Sir Winston Churchill's words when he would say that sometimes doing our best is not enough. Sometimes we must do what is required. And looking at the potential unemployment that may come out of this crisis, seeing how food banks are now having more and more requests on the ground, both in rural and urban areas. Seeing that we're seeing a rise in terms of homelessness across the country. And we're just at the beginning. And knowing that people are still not having to pay their homes to the banks and their mortgages, we can see that this is becoming a perfect storm. If this were a tsunami, we're still at the stage where we're just seeing the water being pulled back and the wave is building. And so I would say that we need to be politically savvy. We have to be very responsible in the way we position ourselves, but we have to live in the real world and look at politics in the perspective of the citizen. I think that citizens now more than ever need us in the opposition and in power to be capable of finding the solutions that are needed. And so the spirit that I think that this crisis brought above when both opposition and government were capable of joining hands to fight the crisis is a spirit that we must be capable of maintaining throughout the months to come. That needs a tremendous effort from both sides. It's a two-way road. And from what I've seen, at least from the Social Democratic Party's leader, that spirit is still very present. And as you were saying, Anselmo, we just approved the supplementary budget. The government decided what it needed for the months to come, and we approved it, basically. And so, and we've seen that those, like the Communist Party that had been with the government for the last years, are now out of that equation as they voted against it. And so clearly there's a political transformation, and this is a call for responsibility of all parties. And I think that we as Social Democrats, being the major opposition party, we have that special responsibility to make sure that we do what the Portuguese people expect from us and need from us at this moment.
Isabel, you are a specialist in Portuguese constitution. I would like to hear you about the one of the biggest challenges that this pandemic brings to us, because it requires very often, mostly in the first months, to cut a lot of rights, constitutional rights. If you have to choose the biggest challenge for a parliament or for the government or even to the president in that period of time, what was the most difficult law to approve, that it's required for one side, but for the other side, it appears like we are going back in our history. Don't have your phone, microphone, yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, I have to say it was the emergency state, or the state of emergency, which is an institute that it's a constitutional institute, but it was never used in our democracy. So I think it's very traumatic for us it was very traumatic for us as a people, and to the parliament, and to the government, and to the president. I'm sure it was very traumatic to realize that we really needed to have a safe legal frame to do what it had to be done in terms of suspension of some freedoms. And to make it according to the constitution, we really had to use the state of emergency. But it was traumatic because everyone loves, of course, freedom, and it was never used in a democracy, the state of emergency, and it's really an exceptional instrument, and it requires the intervention of the president that declares the state of emergency. And he picks exactly the rights that can be suspended with, of course, respecting several constitutional principles. And then the government has to say that he agrees with the state of emergency, and then it has to be approved by the parliament. And it was, of course, very, very difficult. But at the same time, I think that the proposal that came from the president, that was approved by the parliament, was very as restricted as he could have made it. I mean, first he picked,
very balanced, maybe.
Yes, very balanced. He picked like the rights, of course, of circulation, because we couldn't just be around because we were living the beginning of a pandemic, and we wanted to save the national health system, and freedoms like the cults in what comes to religion, or strike, or manifestation. But even in what comes to these freedoms, there were a lot of limitations. Like we could, of course, leave home to work, to have a walk, to go go shopping, to visit our relatives, and so on. So there was actually none of these rights was absolutely suspended. And so that's why the parliament was so almost unanimously, so that's why the parliament almost unanimously approved for 3 times the state of emergency. Yet it was, in my opinion, a moment of trauma in what comes to our history, because it was the first time it was used. But at the same time, it was a good moment, because the state of emergency is inscribed in the constitution precisely to guarantee that in an extreme situation like a pandemic, some things can be done, but only according to strict constitutional principles. So it's predicted precisely to defend our rights, although it's suspending some forms of exercising our rights. So it's like we can see that something traumatic, because it was the first time, but at the same time it's the democratic way to defend our rights, because of course we couldn't have the government per se deciding, well, you can't strike anymore, or you can't go on the streets anymore. This is what makes us a democratic state. It's because we have an instrument that it's inscribed in the constitution. But of course, it's meant to be used in a very, 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 very special situation. That's why it was the first time since 1976 that it was used. And I think it was written by the president in a very balanced way. And now we are out of it, and I still think it's very difficult each time the government analyzes the situation we are in terms of the law he's applying now, to decide the restrictions in what comes to our freedoms that still have to be considered, because it's still very problematic. I think it was the key moment, yes.
Somehow, do you think it was more easy when we are at the emergency state that now, because you have more flexibility to apply some laws?
No, I mean, it's in the state of emergency, in what comes to like write what you can do and what you can do. Of course, it's a frame that's in the constitution. So if you want to say it's easy because you have like a guide map in the constitution, yeah. Yes, and you have like the three sovereign organs involved. So you have the president, the government, and the parliament. But it's not easy, of course, to live in emergency state, and you have to approve every 15 days in the parliament. Now you have a different situation. You have a law which is a law that has to do with the civil protection, that allows you to make other restrictions to fundamental rights. But of course you can't, for example, say that people can have to stay at home, and if they leave, it's a crime. It's not possible without state of emergency. You can't do that kind of things that you could do on emergency state, and it's good that you can't do that. But it's an evaluation you have to do every 15 days too. But it's a different evaluation. I think it's very difficult too. But I would say that the most critical point in what comes to fundamental rights, of course, I would have to answer, it was the emergency state.
David, for you, what was the most challenge law that you have to help to approve, or you saw in Massachusetts, or even in the United States, for this matter? How difficult was for you to feel that you have to cut some rights that no one was supposed to cut?
It's interesting to hear the state of emergency procedures in Portugal that have to be approved by the parliament, and it lasts in 15-day segments. Here in Massachusetts and also in the United States, the states of emergency are declared by our executive. And we are still under our state of emergency in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as declared by our governor. We're in phase 3 now of our reopening. And so we had those limitations of travel, and businesses were ordered closed. Businesses are slowly reopening. We now allow some restaurants to open with certain capacity. No bars are allowed to open. No one can congregate large groups. Outdoor concerts and venues are still ordered closed by the executive. But on the legislative piece, one of the most difficult ones we had, and it was during those informal sessions, and it came to one of the showdowns of members coming in to close the session with objection. In the end, we compromised and moved the bill forward, but it was to put a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures. And so trying to figure out that balance between the property rights and the public safety and health safety of individuals being evicted. We told you you couldn't go to work, so now you can't pay your rent. And if you get evicted, you're going to be homeless during the pandemic. So how do we balance that? And to try to find a way that the debt that individuals were accruing is still owed. So if you are a renter, you still owe the landlord the rent. If you are a landlord and you have a mortgage, you still owe the creditors that hold your mortgage that. But to foreclose or to evict during this period of time, to ban that period. And so we're still working under that law. It's due to expire later this summer. And there are conversations of, do we extend it or what do we do? Like any other law, you find people that try to take advantage. So for those that are fortunate enough to continue to have been working and to continue to be making a living and have the ability to pay either their mortgage or their rent, we do have cases of folks that are just not paying it, saying, I'm going to use that law that says that you can't evict me or you can't foreclose on me. And so this is, I think it was Ricardo was mentioning about these things building up. And so that tsunami that's about to come, I think in our housing market is going to be a big issue because we slowed the construction of new housing, but also for those folks that have accrued debt, and will they be able to make good on those debts, whether they're owners or renters going forward. So, but that took multiple days where we were there all day into the evening, and then we stopped and we came back and talked again with the individuals that had objections to try to get to the point to balance it. I don't know that we have a perfect balance, but we had an acceptable compromise balance on that. So that's one that sticks out in my mind.
Michael, this situation take us to go back and forward all the time, because we don't know how the pandemic will evolve in the next months, in the next year, I will say. So it's even a bigger challenge for the legislative, because you have always to find new ways to respond to the daily pandemic crisis. So for you, what's the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge is trying to stay up to date as issues change almost daily. We feel a lot of pressure from our constituents, and we feel a lot of pressure from our business owners about reopening, allowing them to go back to work and reopen their business and get the economy back on track. At the same time, we're very concerned about this virus reemerging, and we see what's happening in some parts of the country. We are doing really well in Massachusetts. I think that Governor Charlie Baker has done an amazing job at balancing all sides. He's taken a lot of heat. Some people think he's going too fast. Some people think he's going too slow. But he's very much a data-driven guy. It's all about, and he made it very clear right from the beginning of the state of emergency that we will reopen based upon the public health metrics, not based upon the calendar. Because the pressure is it next week? Is it next week? And he made it clear it's look at the numbers and look at the public health metrics. And I think it's working well. We don't know what's going to happen come October, November. We don't know if this virus, as some people think, is going to come back. And so what do we do, for instance, about our schools? We shut our schools down in mid-March. Our schools generally run through the end of June in Massachusetts. So 3 months of school was done remotely, which meant that we had to scramble to provide technology to the students. Not all students have computers or tablets or access to the technology. Not all homes have access to broadband internet. And we've we've done that. It went better in some places than others. Some places went really well. Some places it went very poorly. So what do we do come September? Do we reopen schools? I think the plan now is that we're going to reopen our schools. They're preparing for reopening, but there's issues around social distancing. There's issues around having adequate levels of what we call PPE, personal protective equipment, masks, and the like. There's issues around transportation, that our traditional school buses that we have in Massachusetts, you know, that have 25 seats with 3 kids per seat, can transport 75 students at once. New guidelines is 1 person per seat, 1 kid per, I mean, so there's all kind of issues. And we will make lots of investments in ensuring that our schools can reopen. But what happens, like I said, come October, this virus comes back with a vengeance and we have to shut everything down again. So it's just staying on top of things. It's been a whirlwind, and I'm so proud of how we've handled it in Massachusetts. You know, we just look 1,500 miles to our south in DC, and we see how poorly they're handling it on a national level. And another challenge for Representative Vieira and I is that oftentimes our constituents paint all elected officials, all politicians with the same brush. And so, you know, but the proof is in the pudding with us.
You are a doctor and you are also a politician. About the thing that Michael was talking about, the pressure from the constituents, that of course they are preoccupied with the pandemic and with the public health, but they are mostly preoccupied now with their jobs and with their I don't know, with their business. How is that possible? How can you explain to the people that we have to go step by step and we cannot reopen the economy all at once, even though we have all around the world, we have different countries with different problems, and they are also struggling with this kind of problem?
Well, the truth is we are dealing with a virus that we've known for 6 months, and we've learned a lot throughout this time. And what we have learned has taught us what works and what doesn't in terms of containing the spread of the virus. And what we do know is that the strategy of identifying and isolating and controlling any sources of propagation of the virus are critical to maintain the economy open. So every country is dealing with one of 3 situations. Either we do nothing and we let the virus spread and we embrace the death toll and the pressure that will put on our health systems, which is a model that I think no one in the call in this webinar agrees with. The other one is to go the other extreme, which is everybody stay at home, as we did at the beginning, which would kill our economy and bring even more social convulsion. So I don't feel it's an option either. And so the third option is, the idea was, if we stay at home, to use that time for a couple months to prepare for the months to come. Some countries did better than others in doing that. No matter at what stage we are at, now we have to work with what we've got. And this means that we need to have a system that is capable of identifying in real time those that are infected, in real time, in 24 hours, identifying everyone they were in contact for the last 14 days, and making sure that all of them are kept in isolation. There is no other way. And it can't be a recommendation. It has to be mandatory quarantine. And doing this, we can control the virus. What this means is, if we have this very strict command and control system in place, the rest of us in the economy can keep moving forward as usual. And so this is an expensive system, but it is very cheap if you think that the cost will let you keep the economy flourishing. And there has been some resistance across the world, in applying more strict measures when it comes to this. The other issue is controlling the entrances of the virus. For example, some countries are more rigid when it comes to air traffic control. Others, so like ours here in Portugal, we still are not demanding testing before people get on a plane and fly to Lisbon or Porto or to Faro.
And do you think we should do that?
Yes, I've been fighting for that for more than a month now. And I think that especially now that we've seen, you know, what was mentioned, we're seeing what's happening with our friends in Florida, and we're going to start having direct flights from Miami to Lisbon as of July, as of this month. And so no kind of control actually undermines the confidence of those abroad. We've seen that Portugal has just been blacklisted by the United Kingdom in terms of their travel corridors. We need to reconquer the confidence, and to reconquer the confidence, we need to do what it needs to be done internally in terms of controlling the system. The other aspect is understanding, you know, picking up on Game of Thrones, the winter is coming. And the winter is coming means that we need to ensure that we do everything in our power to lower the demand onto the health system. And so we need to make sure that vaccination for pneumonia, for influenza, flu is provided to all those that need it in a timely manner. We need to make sure that health system is prepared, having hospitals that are COVID hospitals separated from the rest of the system, making sure that we are prepared for a wave worse than the one we saw in March and April, and making sure that the economy does not have to stop if that wave comes. That takes a lot of planning. And what I'm saying with all of this, Anselmo, is that this is a very difficult task, but it is a feasible task. It is possible to prepare and to embrace the challenges of COVID-19 and allow the economy to at least continue to flourish. And this, I think, is an investment that if citizens understand that this investment will allow us to keep businesses open, will allow people to keep their jobs, they will be the first ones to understand that we have to make this investment. And those whose civil liberties, in a way, for 2 weeks will have to be isolated from the rest of society, understand that it's a small sacrifice in the name of the country and to reconquer their own freedoms. And so I think we need a clear conversation on this. We need very clear communication when it comes to public health. Communication has been proven to be one of the most important tools in terms of public health, and communication needs to come with coherence in the measures we apply. We cannot say we cannot have gatherings, but at the same time allow gatherings and things of the sort. And so doing all of this at the same time requires a lot of coordination, control and command. And hopefully here in Portugal, we will see that as things evolve.
Yeah, I would like to hear all of you about this last point of Ricardo about the communication and the importance of the communication in this kind of situation. Isabel, in the last months, I will say, we have heard in Portugal some criticism to the government and to the public authorities, because sometimes the communication and the message that passed to the citizens are a little messed up. One day is one thing, the other day is another thing, and people are sometimes being misconfused about what to do and what not to do. Do you think there is a point now that this is a fundamental point to address and to improve in the next month?
Yes, I do. I think I've been saying from the beginning of this crisis that communication is a key factor, and saying the truth all the time is essential, and in fact is a fundamental right, our right to information and to the right information. I think there is something that we can understand, which is human, and it has to do with the pandemic. Of course, when you are dealing with something that was unknown, and when the international organizations are telling us for instance, at the beginning that you shouldn't wear masks, for instance. And of course, the national entities are following their guidelines, are saying to our population, well, it's not mandatory to wear masks. Actually, it gives you a false sense of security, so you shouldn't wear masks. But some weeks later, the international organizations changed their views because science develops really quickly in what comes to this virus. And so our organizations, our national organizations say, well, you should wear masks. And so we have this confusion. Well, why did you say we shouldn't wear masks and now we are wearing masks? And so there is some part of the changes of in the communication that we have to understand. And because it's human, we are dealing with a virus that was not known, so it's normal that people in power communicate, and the health organizations communicate while they are according to the knowledge they have every day, and we have to understand that and know that people are saying each day the best they can. On the other hand, I think we have to criticize and to be paying attention to the fact that the press leads with it's like it's like paying attention to the virus and almost has no other things to address, and so it's like a very, very, very nervous press. And it's like every day saying, well, 2 more cases here, 10 more cases there, 10 more cases there, or 20 more cases there. And of course, if you are a scientist or a doctor like Ricardo, or a man or a woman that is specialized in virus, and I know many of them, they of course will tell you, well, you don't deal with the pandemic saying every day or twice in a day that you have 10 cases there or 10 cases there. It's impossible to deal with a pandemic like there. And so as a reflex of this, I think the political power in Portugal and in other countries is like managing the panic that exists in the society. And it's very important to tell the truth. And the truth is that you have to give good information and the right information, saying of course that it's impossible to leave our homes because we are not at home anymore, and not expect people to get infected, to get more infections than we had in March. But you have to explain people that it's different to have the virus and to be sick. So it's different to have SARS and to be sick. And you have to explain people that to get like we don't have a vaccine. So if you want people to be immune, like in a group system, immune in a group system, in fact, you have to have more people infected, but in a controlled way, which means that people that are fragile, like old people, have to be protected. And so I think people should in power have to be much more how do you say pedagogic in English? Much more
I don't know.
Yes, much more reasonable, explaining things, and not like just panicking over numbers, because numbers in itself don't tell you anything. If I know that there are 300 people infected every day, that per se doesn't tell me anything, because if those 300 are people with 20, 30, 40 years old, and the numbers of people that are in fact occupying beds in hospital or people that are dying is a low number and it stays the same, that's okay if the number is under control. So the communication is a key factor, and I really think we have many things to improve at that level.
David, can you tell us a little about your experience in Massachusetts and in the US about the communication and the importance of a good communication to the citizen?
Yeah, as I said earlier, our state of emergency is declared solely by the executive. And one of the things that Governor Baker did consistently for the first 2.5 months was a daily press conference. Now he's almost daily, multiple times a week. And I think my constituency has built up through my Facebook page and text messaging and letting them know when that's going to be, giving them advance notice in the morning so they could sort of plan their day to hear what the next message is. But as Isabel said, it's so important to have context when these numbers and this information is put out there, because without context, you have that fear and the panic. Oh, there's more cases. Okay, there's more cases, but what does that mean? And I think that's a continuous challenge, not only for the politicians, but also for public health, because public health arena is still learning more and more about this disease. At one point we heard that, it was all old folks that would get it and get sick and die, and the younger people weren't getting sick. And now in the United States, and I'm assuming it's the world as well, that there's a number of young people who are getting it and they're getting rashes and they're having different symptoms. We all heard about the fevers. You start with a fever. Now we have all these asymptomatic folks. We had a nursing home in Massachusetts where a large percentage of the individuals had tested positive. No one had a fever. No one had any symptoms. And so as we learn that, we need to learn the context and then be able to communicate. And unfortunately, many times folks listen to the first message, wear the mask. And then they're not listening to the continuing saga of this pandemic and learning that there's new information based on science, and now this is what you have to do. So the challenge there is having context for the communication, but regular communication. I don't know how in Portugal the information is distributed, but here, at least in Massachusetts,
daily basis in the first months. Okay. Right now, 3 times per week.
3 times per week. And that's done by the president, the prime minister?
By the Ministry of Health and the Director of Public Health.
Okay. Yeah, and so the way we do it is our governor, and then at the national level, the president has a press conference, and then they have experts from whatever the topic of the day is. So they'll have the public health folks with them. And then when we started talking, as Senator Rodrigues mentioned, about closing schools and education, they'll bring in the Secretary of Education and give you context for that. So it's an ongoing challenge, and particularly trying to contextualize that message and then update the message and get the new message out. It's a challenge.
And do you think the way that President Trump faces this problem, this pandemic in the beginning, it maybe contribute somehow to misleading the citizens?
I think the quality of information at our national level and the consistency of message has been and continues to be lacking. And we had the opportunity as legislators at the state level to participate in state and local government conference calls with the White House. And Dr. Fauci, who many know as our CDC infectious disease expert, he was on these calls, and many times we would be talking directly to him about the messaging. And let's just say it wasn't the same thing we saw in the news at night.
Michael, do you agree? Do you share this view of David?
It's easier for me to be critical as a Democrat. I have been very complimentary of our Republican governor, Charlie Baker. I think he does a marvelous job in communicating. He listens to medical scientists. He's very data-driven, fact-based. He would say a little boring at times, as opposed to our president, who listens to political scientists and not medical scientists, who we would hear Dr. Fauci make a statement, and then 5 minutes later, President Trump would contradict that statement. And I think that has been a challenge right from the beginning of this pandemic, when the president classified it as a Democratic hoax it was fake news. It wasn't real. You know, masks, even to this day, he doesn't wear a mask. Vice President Pence doesn't wear a mask. He convened his rally last week down in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So it's a challenge that I really wish we did not have to compete against a president spewing misinformation when we have a lot of very bright people on both sides of the aisle that are trying to ensure that our citizens are protected, that we take the correct measured response. But as you know, the United States is a very big country. The United States is a very diverse country. And we have states like Massachusetts, in New York, in Connecticut, in California, you know, north on the coast. And then we have the states that in our heartland and down south that would prefer to believe the president versus medical professionals and scientists. They have no value, and it's difficult, and it's a challenge. I feel so bad for my friends in Florida. You know, over 10,000 additional cases yesterday. Every day they're setting new records of new additional cases. And they have a governor down there, in Governor DeSantis, it follows the doctrine of President Trump. You know, to say what's expedient and what's easy instead of what's right. And, you know, it is what it is, though. And once again, I'm just so proud to be from Massachusetts.
Okay, I have one last question before we go to the audience, but I woed like to know your opinion about this. One of the things this pandemic bring it up was that some difficulties that we already have in our democracies, in our countries. Economical difficulties, social difficulties. Isabel, do you think this pandemic, like a lot of people have mentioned in the last months, it might be an opportunity to change and to learn something about what we should do in the past, and right now we are paying the bill with the pandemic?
I hope so. I hope so, because many structural problems that we have in terms of strong differences, social differences, the way people live, the places people live, the struggle many people face just to go to work, to come from work, the housing issues, health issues, so many systemic and structural problems that we knew we had in Portugal, and now they are so crystal and clear, and they are in fact revealing themselves in what comes to number of infected people, in what comes to Lisbon, for instance.
Yeah, social neighborhoods.
The virus, of course, it's stronger if you live in certain places, if you have to fight and take 3-4 buses to go to work every morning, and if you live in very small and with no condition houses, if you even have a house, of course. And so we knew we had of course we knew we were a country with strong problems in what comes to equality, social problems in what comes to equality and economical problem, and also racial differences in what comes to where people live, what kind of jobs these people have. And now I think everyone can see that. It's like there is more light over these issues. So I think it's, I hope it's an opportunity to take the public policies in what comes to these areas really seriously.
David, do you share this vision? You have to open your microphone, please.
One of the things that we've recognized is the deepening of the racial disparities with access to healthcare. And one of the bills that we've passed is to put together a commission that is reporting in real time here during this period of time, but final report later in the summer, to really dive deeper into that and to look at those structural issues. Obviously, for those of you that have followed the news, the racial tensions in the United States are at an all-time high again. It was a particular incident that triggered that, but that particular incident belies the underlying inequities and injustices that are in the system as well. And so I think it was a boiling point, and under these times that pressure was even greater. And those are things that I think we're moving forward. I know the Senator and I were talking earlier this morning. The Senate is dealing with some of those issues next week. The House is preparing a bill as well. But I think that the spotlight at this period of time is really driving us to action. Well, for many years we've talked about it, but we haven't acted on it. And I think if there's any silver lining in this part of the crisis, is to really give us the impetus to move, to really get the data and value the data that we collect, and then to take action on it.
Michael?
Yeah, I agree with Representative Vieira. We spent the first 3 months of the pandemic in the legislature just dealing with the moment of the day, the issue of the day. And we spent a lot of time, for instance, working on legislation to allow our local municipal governments to continue to operate, allowing remote authorization so we can virtually sign legal documents, allowing towns and cities to have to delay town meetings, to delay local elections, and change our public meeting, open meeting laws. Now that the emergency stuff is behind us, we are spending a lot of time trying to prepare ourselves so that we don't get caught again, having to deal with things on an emergency measure, trying to be a little more proactive. And as Rep. Vieira said, then, you know, a few weeks ago, we had the incident with George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the racial tensions have exploded again in the United States and in Massachusetts. We in the Senate are teeing up literally over this weekend to be released on Monday, a major racial justice police reform bill that we will release on Monday in response to that. So it's a busy time, and it's important that we stay in close communication, not only with each other in the legislature, but with our constituents. And, you know, it's easier today with social media. We have tools at our behest, in our control, for us to help inform our constituents. But just to go back to my last statement about all the misinformation out there, it's always a greater challenge when you have to correct misinformation as you're trying to provide proper, real information.
Ricardo, what structural problems do you think this pandemic brings it up?
Well, I think there are some positives at the end of the day, because we've seen in civil society grassroots movements coming about, people in neighborhoods that would not talk with each other, helping the elderly, the most vulnerable, and a lot of involuntary movements that I think have the potential to persist moving forward. A clear understanding that we all need to work together the idea that we're all in the same boat, and you know, private, the public, the social sectors joined hands when things got tough, and that kind of spirit of collaboration is critical as a country wants to develop. But I would say, bringing in the global health issue, this is also an opportunity for us to acknowledge that we've been pretty lucky throughout the last decades. Just over the last 20 years, we had 6 infectious diseases that could have become, could have had the pandemic potential that we've seen with COVID-19. If we think about SARS, Ebola, Zika, H1N1, and so forth, we can understand that we have been playing with luck. And this time, the lack of preparedness at the global scale for potential outbreaks has left us in this situation that has put our economy and social structures at risk. And hopefully now, finally, people understand that our economy cannot, we cannot play dice. We cannot play games when it comes to our economy, as it is the basis of our social structure. So in that sense, looking back at history, you know, there are many moments that led to a major transformation. Going back to the Black Plague, Renaissance came out of that. If you think about World War II in the last century, following that, there was a clear idea that countries needed security and defense, and organizations like NATO came about. And looking at the global health phenomena, I think that we will need to understand that we need something similar, such a revolution, which would be a structural solution to avoid future pandemics, because we all believe in a global world. We know that globalization will continue after we overcome this crisis. People will continue to travel, and hopefully we will be able to make the most of it. So if we believe in this global vision, in this transatlantic vision of the world, then we should be able to develop the tools that are needed to prevent such situations happening again. I like the NATO model because it is based on 3 pillars: on a diplomatic pillar, on a military pillar, and on a lessons learned pillar. And if we look at WHO, the World Health Organization, people are expecting it to be the military branch, in the sense that they wanted the WHO to act on the ground. I worked in WHO before becoming a member of parliament, and I can tell you, they have a $2 billion budget a year for the whole world. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, which only works for the US, has a $14 billion budget. And so we cannot expect organizations to do what they are not designed to do. WHO is a technical body that has some diplomatic tools, and they can be used for that. What we do need is a structure that is capable of organizing public health reserves in each country and having an organization on top of them that is capable of organizing them and coordinating them in a time of crisis, because these biological threats are always cross-border. This means that each country will start to have to need health authorities that are capable of playing war games, if you will, simulation games, preparing for future threats, be it airborne or waterborne or of other nature, to make sure that we are capable, for example, here in the European region, or thinking in a transatlantic mode, since we're with FLAD, we could work together in making sure that we detect early and contain, and avoiding that this can actually happen again. I think really, to end on this point, this is one of those never again moments. And we should sit together and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you, Ricardo. We have 9 questions so far, so I will start to make some of these questions. And an anonymous attendee asked, many strong men are using this pandemic to strengthen their ruling in places like Russia, China, or Turkey. What do you think the future will look like after this? I probably had angry, Isabel. Is it true that we have some presidents, some politicians all around the world that are using this pandemic to strengthen their ruling?
Well, yes, I think this pandemic can show us the best and the worst of our systems around the world. And there are, of course, in what comes to this question allows us to talk about the collateral damages to this pandemic, and one of which I am, of course, truly worried is it's the democracy's health. And there is a report developed by the University of Gothenburg called Varieties of Democracy, and states that 82 countries have diminished and declined democracy because of the pandemic. Luckily, Portugal, according to that study, hasn't been affected by this. But of course, if you see that in this report that 82 countries have diminished and declined democracy, it's a huge number. Of course, we can pay more attention to some countries that are very important because of their scale, and you can see what they are doing. I pay a lot of attention to Brazil because I was born there, and
really?
and I love Brazil, and I feel like a second home, and I think it's tremendous what's happening in Brazil. But of course, it's not only Brazil. It's what's happening in Russia and in other countries. It's very, very serious. But as I'm saying, the study shows that the pandemic, it's like an excuse to disrespect democracy in at least 82 countries.
Yeah. David, do you have a view about this?
So I'd be interested to see the report too, and to be able to look at the countries. But for the individual posed the question, prior to the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of freedom and liberty in Russia and in China, and so in those examples, potentially, you know, because they're near superpower status, that everyone's paying attention to them. But these countries that have traditions of democracy, to see where they are. I think in the United States, while I think our president is playing a lot of politics with this pandemic, allowing too much freedom and liberty is what's happening in Florida and what's happening in these areas where we're rebounding. And so I know from our personal example that when we go the other way, we might be playing politics with the concept, but not taking the strong arm of limiting some of the freedoms that are necessary to be able to stem the tide.
Michael?
Thank you. I think I'd love to see the report also. I wasn't aware of this report. It's sad to see that democracies are being dismissed around the world by so many countries. Carrying on Ricardo's theme of Churchill quotes, my favorite Churchill quote is that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. There will always be around the world those certain leaders in certain countries that have, whether it's China or Russia, where there was not many liberties to begin with, but being able to use a global crisis to their personal benefit. And it's happened before, and I'm sure it is happening now. I really can't comment much more beyond that.
Yeah, but thank you. It was important, Ricardo, about the I don't know, some countries and some politicians.
Well, I think it's inevitable when there is a crisis. Threats to democracy and to civil liberties are normally the first to go, and that is the same here. This is in many aspects similar to a wartime effort we are all making, and we all know that there are very negative outcomes and side effects to any kind of warfare, and one of them is the way civil liberties end up undermined. I would say that this virus and this pandemic has another characteristic, which is it tends to lead people to think that if we are more nationalistic, if we have an insular view, if we close ourselves away from the rest of the world, we will be able to lock out the virus from our own society. And translating that into the way certain policymakers may fall into the temptation of using that to reinforce a nationalistic view, I think may undermine the world order. And that's why I believe, more than ever, multilateralism and many of the Bretton Woods institutions that came out of the Second World War must play a pivotal role in a time when they are seen as discredited, as many are actually dismissing them or even cutting their funding. And I think this is an opportunity, in a way, for us in Europe, believing in such values, to step up. And I think others will follow. And if we are capable to sit around the table, bringing together different nations and understanding that this is a global effort, hopefully we will be able to isolate those that are not complying with the rules we have set for this world order, in which democracies and civil liberties have to be part of that. And I think this is a wider discussion, that we cannot take the risk of being so focused on the crisis of the pandemic in each country to forget the bigger picture.
Thank you, Ricardo. Now we have a question from Daniel Santos. For the politicians from the state of Massachusetts, many states have announced the planned reopening of schools. This is the case in New Jersey. Would you say that reopening schools is a good idea? What do you think should be the protocol for reopening schools, especially in schools district where distancing is particularly challenged? David.
Sure. So just this past week, our Secretary of Education directed our local school authorities, because in Massachusetts, every school district has an independently elected school board that makes the decisions on managing their schools and hires their local school leader, the superintendent. But they were directed to develop a three-phased plan. 1, complete remote learning. 2, a hybrid model. And 3, back to school. And so the districts are now developing those. And I think this is a good first step, good guidance, looking at physical plants, figuring out what social distancing can look like in existing buildings, being able to use different rooms for different classes versus what they would normally be used for. And then as Senator Rodrigues underscored earlier, that Charlie Baker and this administration has been very focused on the public health data. And so as we go through the summer and get into late summer, looking at where we are with the data and deciding what final guidance the Department of Education should issue relative to which of those 3 plans should be used or a hybrid of the plans. So we're now looking at staying home, going back, and doing half and half. During that, we're working in the legislature to make sure that the resources are available to the districts. We're looking at helping infrastructure, making sure folks have hotspots to get homes online that might not have wired access, and making sure that there's the technology that the students can use in the home. So I think we're in the right path here in Massachusetts, is to be prepared for all 3. But again, don't just look at the calendar and say, okay, in September, we're going to do this, because we're not exactly sure what the public health data is going to look like in September. Michael, do you have anything to add, or it's fine like this?
I think Representative Vieira hit the nail right on the head, that we are, I think it's a good idea, a good thing that we're planning to go back to open up our schools again in September. But we are also ensuring that we are prepared for the alternatives. And Rep Vieira hit the nail on the head, and it was a good answer.
Okay, we have here another question for.
Because my father was a carpenter.
Yeah.
We have here another question to Vieira, Senator Vieira and Rodrigues, but I think it might be open to the Portuguese Isabel and Ricardo, what kind of state aid is being provided to the US citizens, and could be implementation of the universal basic income be a way to tackle inequality issues that the pandemic highlights? If so, in what terms or which UBI model do you think could work better? Michael, do you want to start now?
Sure, I'll start with that. We are providing lots of assistance, state aid, to our constituents. As a matter of fact, last night, as I mentioned, the Senate passed its supplemental budget of over 1.1 billion US dollars in state aid in areas such as ensuring there's adequate supplies of PPE, childcare centers, because as we're reopening our economy and there are new rules, post-pandemic childcare is going to look much different than pre-pandemic childcare. So investments in childcare, investments in healthcare, mental health, as well as physical health, rental assistance, housing assistance, food insecurity. I heard mentioned earlier that, you know, our food banks, our homeless shelters are being stressed, and we're providing additional assistance for that. I don't think any sort of universal basic income model really would work in the United States. Each state has different levels of what we call minimum wage to ensure that our citizens, those employed, make a minimum amount of money when they work. We have the highest minimum wage in the country in Massachusetts. But our aid has been primarily focused on providing the resources that our constituents need during this pandemic.
Senator Vieira, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I would just add, at our national level, we have an unemployment system in the United States where the employers pay into the system and the employees have a contribution, and that system creates a fund which, when the individual is unemployed, laid off, not quit or been fired, they can tap into for income. And so during this period of time, individuals who couldn't go to work because of these emergency orders were eligible to tap into unemployment. However, for those individuals that own businesses and weren't paying into that unemployment system, there was no source of income for them as we shut their businesses down. And so at the federal level, passing through to the states, we created a pandemic unemployment assistance. And this is for individuals who own their businesses or sole proprietors or were contractors, so that they would have a source of income while their businesses or their jobs were put on hold by order of the government. Unfortunately, what we've had in the last month is about a year ago, there was the international fraud in the financial markets where folks had tapped into some of the credit agencies. We're finding that by the hundreds, thousands nationally, individuals were utilizing fraudulently obtained data to apply for the unemployment assistance in other people's names. So we had individuals who were getting unemployment for 2 months. I get multiple calls every day. I was getting it for 2 months and it stopped. I don't know why. And they're trying to get a hold of the agency. We find out it's because someone else had applied and was getting a check on their behalf. And so they have to verify identification. They have to take a photograph of their ID with them standing beside their ID and provide it to the government to show that they are really that person to turn those benefits back on. So that's been a very big challenge for us in the last month, is re-verifying those individuals. But that individual benefit to the folks that weren't paying into unemployment systems, the pandemic unemployment has been the sort of the banner program in the United States.
Thank you. Ricardo, a quick question about this. In Portugal, we have some parties that suggest that the government should pay or forbidden the layoffs, or somehow the government should stop the fires. Do you think that we have in Portugal the right answers to the social problem we face right now?
Well, this has been taken on a step-by-step approach by the government. I mean, we in the Social Democratic Party, being the main opposition party, we've made some suggestions that have been accepted, others not. I think in global, for this precise moment, we are seeing some response, although we are seeing a rise of social problems. So clearly the responses are still not enough. I think we need to understand, and picking up what I think Michael was mentioning about the importance of data, we need to know what the reality is on the ground so we can respond. However, those fighting for universal basic income, I have heard the argument that the idea was, and because there's always a question, I have personally two challenges dealing with the concept. One is, if everybody gets the same raise, how will that not impact negatively a rise of costs of basic needs? And secondly, how in a country like our own, where we have so limited resources with such high public debt, how will you pay for it? And how fair is it for us not to support those most that need and giving the same kind of income to those that clearly don't need it? And so it's always the old discussion, but it's a serious discussion that we should be having. Those fighting for UBI say, listen, maybe you can give all the money to everyone, getting rid of the bureaucracy, and then you ask for money back from those who didn't need it at the beginning. The question is, what are the numbers? And how can you do that in real terms? And so from my perspective, looking at the current numbers, we just had this huge debate around the budget. I don't see how we can do that with public money. And so possibly we will have to develop some kind of financial schemes that will be able to support those in greater need. Sadly, the needs at the global level are so big that we can't count, I believe, on the World Bank or IMF to support us in this time of need, especially with such a high public debt. If we were like the Netherlands with a public debt below 60%, possibly we could have margin to go to the markets. So it's a tricky question, but we will have to find solutions, possibly finding solutions within the community, bringing in different partners that traditionally we would not work with, to make sure that especially those that need get the response that is needed. And I fear that, as I said, with the end of the moratoriums of the banks, with the rise of unemployment, we will be facing a turmoil, an unprecedented social turmoil in our country.
Isabel, do you think, do you believe, do we have to improve our social response in this pandemic?
Yes, I think it's very important, the fact that we are a social state. And I think, as Ricardo was saying, that we were, as I said in the beginning, we were doing this from scratch. But it was very important that before the crisis, we were very well in what comes to our budget policy, and in what comes to our results in that policy and in our finances. So we were comfortable in what comes to results before the pandemic. So we had some comfort to face the pandemic. But of course, what we are facing now and what we are going to face, it's so enormous that the things that we did step by step as the situations were arising, like increasing the social benefits that people already have, like old people or poor people or disabled people. All those social benefits were increased. But of course, I think that discussion that was very interesting in Spain, for instance, it's very, very interesting, but I also have many problems with that in Portugal, and I do believe that it's important to insist in our progressive tax system and to increase the social responses, so that we can first know the reality, and we do need to know the reality and to have numbers and to know who are we talking about, and to really make to make differences between who is really in need and who is not in need, so we can really work on inequality. I think it's a very hard discussion, but I don't feel very comfortable with that idea.
Okay, we are almost at the end of this debate. We have 2 minutes, but I think we can answer to a last question, a very practical one, and I suppose a very difficult one too. An anonymous attendee also, he asked if we have a second wave of the virus in the winter, do you have any plans to support parents staying at home with their kids? And what about the kids? Isabel, do you want to start now?
Actually, I don't believe so much in a second wave. I believe in several. I don't know how to say planalto in English, but we are like trying to maintain
a direct line.
A direct line, and I think if we are if we are really careful in what we are doing, allowing people to go out, go to work, but still protecting the vulnerable people and the old people who are of course vulnerable people, and allowing the economy to work, I think that we can manage to have several different periods of these moments of like 300 cases every day like we are living now. If we can guarantee that the numbers of sick people that really need to be in the hospital and people that unfortunately that lose their lives that doesn't increase. So of course it's possible that we have a second big moment, and if that happens, I hope not. I would prefer to stay like I was describing now, and some scientists believe that it's possible to, even with winter, to stay like I was just describing the situation. Of course, we as politicians and the government and everyone involved in policy has to be prepared to do whatever it's necessary and to take action, and everyone that needs help has to be attended.
Ricardo, do you have an opinion about the second wave and the kids problem?
Well, we're going to face multiple waves. It's inevitable, as we are seeing here in Lisbon following what happened in the north of the country. The question is, how do we deal with it? And as policymakers and those in government, I think we need to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And in that sense, we need to make sure that, as I mentioned at the beginning, acknowledging that the winter is coming, prepare our health system to respond, do everything in our power for, as Isabel was saying, to make sure that most vulnerable populations are not afflicted with other correlated non-COVID diseases like flu, like pneumonias, like other respiratory viral infections, and making sure that they are kept healthy and safe, so that they are not overburdening our health system that will need to respond. We need to have clear systems prepared for COVID. And the most important aspect, I'll end where I started, is to identify, isolate, and control. And this means that if we want to keep our economy open, if we want to continue to live in an open society, we have to identify those that are suspects and infect and make sure they are completely isolated. And so this answers the question from our viewer about the support to children that stay at home and so forth. If we need to close schools again, it's because we have failed completely in the preparation for the worst. And so I call on those in government. It's not just the Portuguese government, because this is a cross-border issue. If one country starts to fail, it tends to overflow. We're all in this together, but hopefully, as I said, preparing for the worst, we must hope for the best.
David? I imagine there is also a question in Massachusetts. David, can you hear me? No? Michael, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It looks like Dave might be frozen up there.
Maybe.
We have, since the beginning of this pandemic, recognized the fact that families are staying home, people are staying home, children are home and not in school, and we've been providing help and resources and tools to them. And we will continue to do so. I'm confident that our schools are going to reopen and be prepared, but just nobody knows that, you know, if this virus rebounds in such a drastic way, what that's going to look like.
Okay, so we came to the end of this debate. I will thank you all. It was my pleasure to be here talking with you this sunny afternoon. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, David. I don't know if he is listening to us. And thank you to all of you that were here with us. I hope this debate was useful for you. Have a great weekend.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.